Welcome to India, Mr.
Thank
Spielberg, and thank you for being with us today. Obviously, this isn't your very first visit to India, is it?
No, I've been here several times before, but not. This is my. It's been 30 years since I've been back to India. I was here. The last time was in 1983.
Were you making films then?
Yes, Temple of Doom, and I was here on my own, backpacking through the country.
Where did you go?
But everywhere.
Really?
Yes, Benares, Calcutta, Delhi, Jodhpur, Jaipur, a lot of places. But I started here in 1977, and I shot a very small scene from my movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind in a very small town, about 3-hour drive outside of Bombay.
Oh.
And that was the.
So I was here. Very many people know that. What was it that impressed you most about India at that point in time, when you were backpacking?
I think that people were welcoming of a foreigner, that they would invite me to eat with them. They would invite me to stay with them. They didn't know who I was. It was after I had made Jaws and after certainly Close Encounters came out. It was so great that nobody knew who I was. I remember that as being one of the happiest moments of my life. The relative anonymity of just traveling through India.
Is that something surprising for you, or is that something that isn't very prevalent in the United States of America?
No. There's no anonymity there. You know, you can be an actor in one television show that everybody watches, and that's the end of your privacy. It's over.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Mr. Spielberg, you started off very early in your life. I believe as a child you once took an 8mm camera and made your first film with your mother being in the star cast.
Yes, I did.
What inspired you to do that?
Well, I think well, for one thing, the first time I picked up a movie camera was because I was wrecking my electric trains when I was about 12 years old. I was crashing the two trains into each other and making a complete mess, and sometimes the trains would break and my dad would have to take them back to the electric train store to get them fixed, and he told me if I ever broke my trains again, he would take the entire set away. And we had an 8mm Kodak movie camera. And I remember coming home from school one day and setting up a couple of shots, and I photographed the trains crashing. And luckily the trains didn't break, but I had it on film. I got one train going left to right. Then inside the camera, I stopped. I put the camera on the other train, keeping the screen direction right, the other train going right to left. And I set the camera down, shooting straight out at the track, and both trains came together and crashed. And then what I wound up doing was looking at that piece of film, 90 seconds of film, over and over and over again, and it satisfied my need for some reason to break things in those days. And in that sense, I discovered the power of cinema.
Right.
And I started making little movies after that.
Yes. Your first film was Duel.
Yes.
Very unusual topic, very unusual subject. A truck on a highway chasing a man in a car. And I remember seeing it, many years ago, and just overawed by the concept of that film. What drove you to making a film like that?
Well, the great thing about movies is, before the director, there must be a writer. And Duel was totally conceived by Richard Matheson, great science fiction fantasy writer. And he had written this amazing story, and I was the lucky beneficiary of having my assistant at the time read the story. It was a short story in Playboy magazine. And my assistant came over to me, and I was just a young television director, but we all had secretaries. And she said, "I think this is right up your alley. I think you should make this into a movie." And she gave me the Richard Matheson short story. And then she found out that it was in fact going to be a TV movie for ABC. And she encouraged me, if I liked the story, to go apply for the job, which I did. I went out and I kind of imposed myself on met the producer who was producing it, and tried to talk my way into getting the job. And that's how it all began.
The one thing that really caught my attention in Duel was the very effective use of sound effects. every time the truck would appear, there would be just the sound of the truck, which was almost frightening, the way it was cut. Was that deliberate?
Well, the truck, had a presence that was very important. I really thought it was a monster movie. I mean, I approached it like a Japanese Toho monster movie. Instead of Godzilla, I had this 18-wheeler, obviously empty because it didn't blow up at the end, tanker truck. And there was something about creating a kind of oral threat to it, a real, auditory menace. And so we had some really young and new sound effects artists working in television at Universal at the time, who came up with a leitmotif to give the truck a kind of personality through just sound effects. So a lot of the truck is a sense of the vibration, a very low bass whenever the truck came by.
Yes.
They recorded the truck going by all the time, but then they did some doctoring to the sound and got the truck in a much lower, deeper register.
You've always had a desire to do something different all the time. Whether it's a jewel, whether it's a shark or an extraterrestrial being. How do you make these decisions of doing something different?
Well, I think what happens is, I don't go...
A lot of the actors actually are being threatened by this. I hope you know that.
Well, as I've aged...
The greatest remembrance that all actors are going to, think of is that, the best actors is a fish, a robot, and somebody from outer space.
Yes, but as I move beyond middle age into that unspecified period of time, I've actually turned to actors to save my career. So I turned to Daniel Day-Lewis, I turned to Tom Hanks, I turned to Leonardo DiCaprio. So I have made my case with the actors to make more actor-based films. But when I was first starting out, I love big, high-concept movies. I like the idea. If the idea made me want to see the movie, then I wanted to figure out how can you write to that idea and really put it on display. So in my younger years, I did a lot of conceptual figuring out how to make a movie around a shark. Now, of course, I had the help of a book. Richard Matheson wrote Duel, and Peter Benchley wrote the novel Jaws. And so about 3/4 of my films all come from books. And because of that, you've already got a leg up. Half the work's already been done.
Yes. But you have switched to working with actors. And
I always work with actors, but
they just don't happen to be a fish and a robot.
Exactly.
But even in the casting process, I've noticed that they've been very unusual. Tom Hanks as a soldier, for example. Why would you have thought that?
Well, Tom's a great leader. I mean, Tom has profound leadership abilities, and it comes through in a lot of his work on the screen. Yeah, he started as a comedian. He started doing a television show, called Bosom Buddies, where he was always dressed as a woman every day. And he started, doing jokes, and he started in comedy. But there was, in every comedy actor, there is a very serious dramatic actor. You really can't do great comedy unless you have a deep dramatic core. And Tom always had that, and Tom always had a penchant for drama. And as Tom matured, his films became more serious, and Tom and I became friends. I produced 3 movies that Tom was in as an actor, and we got to know each other really well. And I just thought Tom could do anything. He could be a politician, he could be the President of the United States for that matter. And so it wasn't that far of a reach to imagine Tom playing Captain John Miller.
Right. You've always apparently enjoyed the Bond movies.
I love the Bond movies.
And would you say that Indiana Jones was a kind of a inspiration from Bond films or a tribute to Bond films?
Well, not really, because when George Lucas came up with the idea of Indiana Jones, he was basing his concept on the movies that Republic Studios used to make. These serialized adventures that would show in between a double feature back in the 1940s and early 50s. You'd have a feature, then you'd have a bunch of cartoons, then you'd have a newsreel, and then they would show a kind of 14-minute segment of a movie with a cliffhanger at the end of it. And they do 15 or 16 of these little interstitials. And by the end of it, you saw an entire movie, each one having a thrilling cliffhanger. So the Indiana Jones concept was based on the old serials from those black and white American serial days.
Ever thought of directing a Bond film?
I tried to direct a Bond film, and Cubby Broccoli wouldn't hire me. You know, I went to Cubby and I called him up on the phone, and I just said I had done a couple of movies. I had just started out. I had actually done Jaws, and it was a big hit. And I thought, well, that'll convince him that I can direct a Bond picture. And I got him on the telephone, and I said, I really would love to do your next Bond picture. He said, you're not experienced enough. You know, and he said, if we ever do one on the water, I'll call you. And so that was the end of that. And then a number of years later, after Close Encounters came out, you know, in Close Encounters, there's a 5-note sequence that the aliens send to us, and then we send those 5 notes back to the aliens. So Cubby was making Moonraker, and he wanted to use the 5-note sequence as a parody on Close Encounters in the Bond film. But he needed my permission. Thank God for the Directors Guild of America. They really protect us. They really do. So he called me, got me at the office, and he asked if he could use those 5 notes. And I immediately said yes. And then I said, do you have a slot open? I've made 2 huge hits, Jaws and Close Encounters. I got nominated for Oscars on both films. And he said, did you win? I said, no. He said, well, no. No, not this time. Later, I'm making a movie in 1986. I was the second unit director, and I produced a movie which I wrote the story. Dick Donner was the director. It was called The Goonies. Mm-hmm. And in the film, a kid who loved the James Bond films plays the James Bond theme on a little ghetto blaster he's wearing around his neck, across his chest. But I needed the rights to the Bond theme. And I had given Cubby Broccoli the rights to my 5 notes. So I called Cubby on the phone. I said, I'm making this little picture. There's a really nice homage to James Bond. This kid comes flying in on a bungee cord, and he lands in this room, and he's playing the James Bond theme. And can I get the rights? And Cubby said, no. And I said, Cubby, I gave you free of charge the 5 notes from Close Encounters of Their Kind. He said, the Bond theme is 7 notes. But he eventually finally gave me that. So that was my consolation prize. He would never hire me to do Bond, no matter how successful my career. He would never let me in the front door, but I got the notes for free.
Yeah. But, Mr. Spielberg, you've been a producer, a director, an executive producer. How do you decide which particular project of yours you're going to executive produce? And have there been occasions sometimes when you felt that, much like Cubby did, that a particular film or a story was not worth putting your name to it and withdrawn from it?
I don't think I have. I think once I make a commitment to either produce or direct, I pretty much keep that promise to myself. And in the sense of producing, I have a kind of obligation to the production company that I promised to, work on film. So I'm pretty much, what makes me decide to direct for me is still a big unknown mystery. I still can't really tell you why something like Amistad, a clearly non-commercial movie, would grab me so passionately and would keep me interested for 2 years until it was finished. And why a movie like American Beauty, which I produced, would not compel me to direct it when Sam Mendes did a brilliant job directing it. And I don't know what the reason is. I think maybe some movies are destined to be yours, to belong to you, and some movies aren't. And my wife read American Beauty. I brought it home one night, and she said, this is your next picture. You must direct it. It's one of the greatest scripts I have ever read, including some of the last few movies you've directed. And it didn't speak to me that way. I knew it was a good picture, but it just didn't speak to me, or didn't speak to that part of me that needs to make that critical decision to take over the whole project. And I went and hired a complete unknown to direct it. Sam Mendes had only done stage work, had never made a movie before, but I loved his theater work so much I thought he could do an extraordinary job, and he did. He won the Academy Award.
There's always been an emotional quotient in every film of yours. And is emotion close to you? And what is the deciding factor? Is business more important for you or the emotional factor in a story?
No, the emotional factor in the story always trumps
Because you
business.
have been breaking the business barriers very often.
But what calls to me is not whether a film is going to make $1 gazillion. Mm-hmm. What calls to me is there a deep urge in the center of myself that only that film will release and then exorcise. And that's the only condition I'll direct a movie. If I'm doing a sequel, of course. If I'm doing The Lost World, The Secret of Jurassic Park, of course, I know that the bar's been raised, because if it doesn't make this X amount of money, everybody thinks it's a failure. And there's that added pressure of great expectation. The Indiana Jones series, they're not sequels, but on all the other 3 Indiana Jones films that I've directed, there's a tremendous level of expectation, and that's nerve-wracking. Yeah. But the fact that those movies are successful and make a lot of money isn't why I decided to direct sequels to the Indiana Jones series.
Emotion is a great factor in the films that we make here in India. Mm-hmm. And are you aware of any of our work?
I'm not as aware as I should be sitting up here, being somebody with international claim. We don't have great access to Indian films in America. We don't have, like they do in other countries, you go to any country in Europe or Asia, and you go to a hotel, and there are channels, and each channel is based on a country. Right. And there's movies, and there's news, and there's culture, and there's commentary from each of the different countries. We don't have that in the U.S.
Why?
Commercial reasons. If something is not deemed to be commercial or to make a connection with a demographic or a certain demographic, it's not considered to be worth putting on the air. So that's why Robert Redford did such a wonderful thing by inventing the Sundance Channel. And we also have a channel called the Independent Film Channel. These are 2 very valuable channels because we expose films from offshore, often for the first time, to an American audience. But we don't have enough of those channels. Right. And we don't have enough countries represented on American television that would give a chance for people who love movies to see the movies that come out of India.
What do you think we should be doing for a greater exposure in, say, the United States of America?
I don't think it's anything that you need to do. It's something we need to do. We need to do this for global culture. Not just because I'm here in India talking to wonderful filmmakers, and certainly to yourself, who we all are aware of in America. But it's because, the world has shrunk to the size of a postage stamp because of the social networking. And just because of the breakthrough of the information highway, mm-hmm. The oceans have narrowed and countries have come closer together, and cultures aren't so different when we can all share each other's art. And when that starts to happen, it's really up to the host country to find ways of streaming the art and the culture and the great ideas and the great inspiration from a country like India. So that's not really your responsibility. It's our neglect and our need to be more responsible to exposing Americans to more films from around the world.
As somebody who is so influential in Hollywood and in America, would you propagate our case for us, please? Because we do need a lot more exposure.
I have propagated your case, and I will propagate the case. And part of the relationship, the fringe benefit of this great relationship that DreamWorks is having with Reliance and Anil Ambani and Amitabh Bachchan is the fact that this is one of our goals. One of our goals is to build the cultural bridge between India and the United States.
Right, right.
We're already building the bridge now.
Yeah. Mr. Spielberg, you have often said in some of your interviews that if you want to be remembered by some of your films, it would be E.T. and Schindler's List. Why?
Well, E.T. is the movie that when I go to different places, people talk about the most. You know, and it used to be just young people talking to me about Schindler's List, but that young demographic has really grown up, and now they're talking to me about showing Schindler's List to their children. And I'm getting so old, grandparents are telling me stories about their grandkids seeing not Schindler's List, but E.T. for the first time. So that's the film that people talk about the most when I travel. And the other film that people talk about the most when I travel around is Schindler's List.
Right. Is that just that reason, or was there something else behind?
Well, E.T. was the film that got me to want to be a dad for the first time. I was a bachelor and I had no children, and I worked with Drew Barrymore and Robert McNaughton and Henry Thomas, who played Gertie and, you know, and the three kids. And by the end of E.T., I did not want to leave those kids with their parents. I just wanted to take those kids home with me and raise them. And I just simply realized that the entire E.T. was about my own search for, I guess, the parent in me. It was a healing movie because my mom and dad got divorced, and essentially E.T. is about an American family and a divorce and its impact on children. And I was working on a script about an American divorce when I got the idea to do the alien being stranded on Earth, and I combined both concepts. So in a sense, that movie was, at that time in 1982, the most personal thing I had ever done. And it led 3 years later to my having my first child.
Right. You have many children now.
I have
grandchildren.
seven now, and 3 grandchildren.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do they see your films?
They do. They don't like all of them. Because there's we used to joke about this when I was growing up. In the 60s, we used to scream at anybody over 30 years old that there was a generation gap and you don't understand us. And my kids are now throwing that right back at me.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because they tell the truth. They really tell me the truth.
Which are the ones that they like the best?
I think the movie that my kids like, it depends because they like different movies at different times as they grow up. But the movie that they always talk about is E.T. I just have to say that's the one that they and Indiana Jones, the entire series, they like that the best, except they don't like the last one I made so much.
You've been making films at a time when there have been many contemporaries of yours, Coppola,
George Lucas,
Scorsese, Brian De Palma,
right, Martin Scorsese.
Did you ever build relationships with them to discuss the future of cinema or what you were doing? Or was there envy in what the other person was doing?
Yes, there's always envy. Envy is a good thing. You can't rise to any great height without not just envy, but it's because envy might be the wrong word. It's more jealousy and ambition and wanting to do better than those guys. And they all felt that way. We all felt that way about each other. But in trying to inspire each other and outdo each other, we worked together and collaborated with each other to make our films better. My movies are better for having Francis, George, and Marty and Brian in my life. And I think some of their films are too.
Was there ever a time where you felt that perhaps if you had directed one of the films that you saw of your contemporaries, you would have done a better job?
No, I really don't think so. I mean, nobody but George could have done Star Wars.
I was just going to ask you that. Well, would you have done a Star Wars?
No. I would never have done them because my space movies are about, I don't want to go all the way out there to find aliens. I want them to come to Earth. It's much more convenient. I want them landing in my backyard. I don't want to have to lift a finger. You know, George likes to go, millions of light years out there. He loves that. He loves, what is that, far, far away, the galaxy far, far away. So that wouldn't have been in my wheelhouse. And arguably, but for me, one of the greatest movies ever made in the history of cinema is the first Godfather. Nobody could have done Godfather 1 and 2 like Francis. No one. Yeah. Marty, George, all the original group that grew up together, none of us could have done that the way Francis did.